folks. Welcome to another episode of The Real Man. Now, I know I've been gone for quite a while, but that's how life happens. You're throwing some curveballs and find yourself with very little time in the day to do projects anymore. But no need to be alarmed, because now I'm back, and I'm hoping to bring you guys more content on a more regular basis. Now, let's start the show. As you can undoubtedly tell from the decor of my house, Halloween is very nearly upon us again, and it's without a doubt my favorite holiday. It's filled with so many fun traditions, like decorating your house, carving a jack-o'-lantern, roasting pumpkin seeds in the oven, making a cool costume, throwing a killer party, and of course, trick-or-treating. Memo to self, get more candy. Now, one of my favorite traditions to do around this time of year is to make some good food, some popcorn, kick back on the couch, and watch some scary movies. Now, while most folks usually go on marathons of Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and various other slasher gems, I find myself thinking the exact same thing each time. These movies, although while fun and entertaining to watch, they don't really evoke the spirit of what I believe Halloween to be all about. So, what I've done is I've extensively gone through the Real Man video collection, and I've made 10 selections of films that I think you should watch around this holiday season that manage to capture some of the magic of what Halloween is all about. Now, this is not going to be an in-depth review of each one. This is just an overview of my top 10 picks. More thorough stuff to come later. But now, let's get this spook show on the road. First up on my list is John Carpenter's Halloween. I mean, the title just says it all. Now, the basic gist of the story is it starts in 1963 when a young kid named Michael Myers brutally murders his teenage sister for no apparent reason whatsoever. Then about 15 years later, on the exact anniversary of his crime, he escapes from a mental hospital where he's been incarcerated and returns to his hometown of Haddonfield to pick up where he left off. Soon the bodies pile up, and 17-year-old Laurie Strode finds herself right in his crosshairs. Her only hope for survival is his psychiatrist, Dr. Sam Loomis, who is hell-bent on putting an end to the nightmare. Now, I already reviewed this movie all the way back in episode 1, along with a sequel, which I highly recommend, and I was pretty thorough, to say the least. But this has to be mentioned again. Because for one thing, you got John Carpenter, who wears 3 different hats as director, writer, and composer, and he wears all 3 pretty well. Then you got the inclusion of veteran actor Donald Pleasence and future movie star Jamie Lee Curtis in the starring roles. And it features the creation of a brand new breed of horror villain. Step aside Frankenstein, Wolfman, and Dracula, Michael Myers has just arrived. Now, with its haunting atmosphere and its creepy music score, and the fact that it takes place on the Halloween season, there's really no beating the original Halloween. It's a classic. Next up is The Crow. Now, this is the only movie on the list that's not a horror movie. It's more of a dark action thriller that's based on a comic book of the same name. Now, the story starts on Devil's Night, which is the night before Halloween. A young rock musician named Eric Draven and his fiancée Shelley are brutally murdered by a vicious gang of street criminals. Then 1 year later, Eric returns from the grave when a crow brings his soul back to the land of the living. Now armed with a small arsenal of supernatural powers and guided by his new feathery friend, Eric then proceeds to hunt down the criminals one by one and exact brutal justice on them, eventually going up against the king of the city's underworld, the villain known as Top Dollar. Directed by Alex Proyas, The Crow is a dark and stylish masterpiece that's tinged by tragedy. And that tragedy is the unfortunate death of its star, Brandon Lee, thanks to a stunt gone wrong. Now, despite the focus on action, The Crow makes use of a very classic horror trope, which is the dead rising from the grave to get revenge on the people who murdered them. It's got an incredible soundtrack, and it's got this really deeply haunting romantic story about two people who love each other so much that not even death can keep them apart. All in all, this is a definite must-watch. Then there's the Universal Monster movies. Now, this is a pretty broad selection because there's so many of the damn things. I mean, you got the story of Dracula, which is about an aristocratic vampire who seeks to rejoin the world of mankind and find a mate to share eternity with a whole lot of blood-sucking in between. Then you've got Frankenstein, the cautionary tale of an arrogant young scientist who seeks to defeat death, but with his hubris, he creates a monster. Then there's the Wolfman, the tragic tale of a good man who is cursed by fate and doomed to become a beast whenever the moon is full. Then there's the Mummy, the story of an ancient sorcerer who has waited 3,000 years to be reunited with his one true love. Then there's the Invisible Man, another tale about the dangers of science that transform an honorable visionary into a power-hungry lunatic that can vanish into thin air whenever he wishes. Now, this is a situation where I find myself not being capable of recommending just one. I recommend any of them, all of them, whatever ones you can find. Next up is Tales from the Crypt and the Vault of Horror. Now, this selection is two films simultaneously for a couple of reasons. One, they're both very similar to each other, and two, they're more widely available as a double feature. Now, both films are made by Amicus, which was a British studio, and they're the first ever big screen adaptation of the EC Horror Comics library. Both films are anthological in nature. They're made up of multiple seemingly unrelated stories, all connected by a larger frame story. Now, in Tales from the Crypt, the five strangers end up meeting in these ancient catacombs and find themselves getting trapped in a room with no way out. It's here that they meet the mysterious Crypt Keeper, who offers to help them get out, but only if they listen to his stories to tell. And as each one unfolds, the strangers begin to realize that these stories might be warnings of a dire future that awaits them. In the Vault of Horror, five men meet on an elevator in a modern office building in London and soon find themselves trapped on a sub-basement level in a lounge area. Now, feeling that someone's going to come get them eventually, the five men decide to make the most of it by sitting down, having drinks, and telling stories about these peculiar recurring dreams that they've been having. And as each bizarre tale unfolds, the men come to the horrifying realization of what they mean and why they're there. Now, why are these movies good for a Halloween choice? Well, I mean, what better time of year to tell spooky stories than Halloween? And this movie's got 10 of them all together. Everything that covers a broad range of the horror spectrum, like psycho Santa Clauses, killer zombies, vampires, ancient curses, vengeful magicians, etc., etc. Next up is The Monster Squad. Directed by Fred Dekker and co-written by Lethal Weapon scribe Shane Black, it's a perfect mixture of horror and comedy, bringing back the classic monsters of old and having a little fun with them in the process. Now, the story takes place in the present day of 1987. A group of kids, when they're not in school that is, spend their days hanging out in their clubhouse, eating some junk food, drawing pictures, having horror movie trivia nights, and spying on the pretty girl across the way who can't get the point to close her blinds whenever she's changing her clothes. These kids are called the Monster Squad. But soon they learn that the monsters that they're obsessed with are actually real. Now, when they stumble across the diary of famed vampire hunter Abraham Van Helsing, they learn about the existence of a magical amulet that serves to protect the delicate balance between good and evil in the world. Now, apparently every 100 years at the stroke of midnight, the amulet is vulnerable to attack. Now, if it gets destroyed, that means evil will reign supreme forever. Well, soon after learning this, Dracula and a small army of other monsters show up in town because the amulet is close by and the 100-year deadline is approaching. With nothing less than the fate of mankind at stake, the Monster Squad arm up, join forces with the kind-hearted Frankenstein monster, and set out to put Dracula, the Wolfman, the Mummy, and the Gill-Man back in the ground. Now, this movie is often described as being the Little Rascals versus the monsters, and that's a pretty apt description, to be fair. I mean, it's hilarious, it's action-packed, it's heartwarming, everything that makes it a cult classic and a must-watch around Halloween. Next up is the Saw series. Now, this is another situation where I find myself incapable of recommending just one. I recommend as many as you can stand. Now, some people call the Saw series torture porn, others call it the series that defined modern horror films. Well, I look at this as sort of being a fun and gnarly haunted house attraction with an intriguing and complex mythology behind it, and probably one of the most compelling horror villains I've ever seen. Now, the series follows the unfolding narrative of John Kramer, the man known to all as the Jigsaw Killer. But unlike most serial killers, Jigsaw is different. First of all, he doesn't actually kill anyone. Instead, he locks them in these bizarre death traps that have a game themed around them. And he gives them a choice. They can either play his game and win their lives back, or they can die. And his motives about it are seemingly altruistic. I mean, his victims range from drug dealers, drug addicts, scam artists, adulterers, and anyone else guilty of that most unpardonable sin in his mind, taking life for granted. Now, with each new installment of the movie, we learn more and more about Jigsaw's motivations and the tragic circumstances that led him down this path. And with each one, we find ourselves vilifying him less and less and less, and eventually, we almost root for the guy in a way. Now, for years when the franchise was still going strong, the tagline was, "If it's Halloween, it must be Saw." And that tradition's holding true now with a new installment and simply entitled Jigsaw coming out later this month. So I would say if you got the stomach for it, go for it. By the early 1990s, horror films were on their way out, and the slasher film as we know it was dead and buried. Then 1996 happened, and Scream was unleashed upon the world. It was directed by the late great Wes Craven, and it was written by Kevin Williamson. And this is the movie that brought the slasher film back to life. How did it do it? Well, simple. They honored what made the classic old generation slasher movies of old fun, and also in a good-natured way poked fun at them. Now, the film takes place in the idyllic California community of Woodsboro. A local girl gets brutally murdered along with her boyfriend, and the adult community is absolutely scared to death. But the teenage community suddenly notices some parallels between slasher movies and the actual crime. And of course, things get even more terrifyingly real when the killer turns his sights on Sidney Prescott, who just got done losing her mother in a similar murder a year earlier. And as the killer starts to up his game and the body count gets bigger and bigger, the truth becomes clear. This killer is out to make his own real-life slasher movie, and he wants Sidney as the star. Now, what makes this film so good to watch around the holiday season? Well, because it's fun, and that's what Halloween movies should be. They're fun, spooky, good times. And plus, it's got this atmosphere of self-awareness about it, to where almost like the characters know this is a horror movie, and they know that their characters in it, and they are falling prey to the same cliches as characters in those movies are prone to do, and they even end up mentioning this in the film. Next up is John Carpenter's The Fog. Now, after Halloween became the big hit that it is, a lot of people assumed that Carpenter and Deborah Hill were going to do a follow-up to it as a sequel. Well, that didn't happen right away. Instead, they decided to shelve Michael Myers and do a good old-fashioned ghost story, this being the result. Now, the story takes place in the seaside community of Antonio Bay. It's the 100th anniversary of their founding, and they are celebrating the occasion in style. But then, the town's blood-soaked past comes back to haunt them. An unearthly fog bank drifts in the town, and with it, the vengeful spirits of the Elizabeth Dane have returned. It was a ship that was sunk over 100 years earlier by the town's founding fathers for profit. Well, now the ghosts have come back and they want revenge on the ancestors of the town's founders. And they are hunting them down one by one, and soon the only person that's really left to do anything about the situation is the town DJ, Stevie Wayne, who's attempting to try to guide people to safety. Now, this is just great to watch around the holiday season because it's a ghost story, and what could be more fun than that? And granted, it's not as groundbreaking as Halloween was, but it's got a creepy atmosphere, it's got a creepy soundtrack like Halloween does, and I think it's a worthy follow-up. Next up is Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, another movie I've reviewed on the show before, all the way back in episode 2. It's the third installment in the Halloween franchise, and it's by far the most hated one, for the simple fact Michael Myers is not in the movie. Reason being, because it takes place in a standalone universe that's not connected to the first two films in any way. Now, the story takes place in California the week before Halloween, where a toy store owner ends up in the hospital half dead, muttering to the loud, "They're going to kill us all, they're going to kill us all." Well, eventually he gets murdered in his hospital room by an assassin, and the attending doctor, Dr. Chalice, he's convinced that something very weird is going on, and his only clue he has to go on is the children's pumpkin Halloween mask that the guy was clutching in his hands. Teaming up with the dead guy's daughter, Ellie, he ends up following the trail to the Silver Shamrock Novelties Company, which is the mask's manufacturer. And after some good snooping around, they discover Silver Shamrock is not what they appear to be. They are a bunch of bloodthirsty pagans that are looking to take Halloween back to the good old days, back when it was about mass sacrifice. Now, the masks are a part of an evil plan that they have to commit mass genocide against millions of children around the world. So, Ellie and Dr. Chalice have to race against the clock to stop Silver Shamrock before it's too late. Now, I sang this film's praises before, and some people might have agreed with them, some might not have, but I still hold true this is a good choice for around the season because it's the first one to really explore the true origins of what Halloween began as. And lastly is Night of the Living Dead. A very unfortunately timed edition thanks to the sad and sudden passing of George Romero earlier this year. And the guy was a visionary whose absence will be felt for many years to come. But what better way to celebrate his life than to go and take a look at what is probably his greatest achievement, the great granddaddy of all zombie films. Now, the greater narrative of the story is this unfolding crisis across America. For some unknown reason, the recently dead are returning to life and to eat the flesh of the living. Now, the small-scale story follows 7 survivors who are holed up in a farmhouse on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, I believe. And as the zombies descend upon the farmhouse, the survivors are just squabbling amongst themselves about who's in charge and what should be done next. Well, pretty soon, the zombies are cutting off every possible escape route as time goes on, and the survivors are going to have to work together in order to get out alive, if their distrust and paranoia doesn't doom them first. Now, this is not an obvious choice for a Halloween film, but it's a masterpiece. It's the movie that created the modern zombie film as we know it, and because it has this very claustrophobic nature about it, and it takes place over the course of one night, I think it's perfect for the season. Well, that's all for now, folks. Those are my 10 spooky suggestions for how to celebrate October 31st. Some of them you may have seen before, others you may be just discovering for the first time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please like, share, and subscribe in order to see more content when it pops up. Until next time, have a happy Halloween.